citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts.
Several shots were fired as President Kennedy's motorcade passed through downtown Dallas.
None of us will ever forget this day. Yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world.
This is Houston. Say again, please.
Houston, we've had a problem.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
I have a dream. My four little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
Welcome to the Hagmann Daily Show, weekdays 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And now your hosts, Joe Hagmann and Jon Robberson.
Hello and welcome to this, what is today, Wednesday, May 23rd edition of the Hagmann Daily Show. I'm sorry, I'm having a problem with my audio. There we go.
I'm only laughing because I don't know what day it is either, Joe. Good thing we have good guests.
In and out, John, and I can't even, it's doing it right now. So I see that my sound is registering on the, there we go, on the Audacity, but I can't hear. I'm going to have to get new headphones. Anyway, we got a great show for you today. We have Tracy Bean. She's going to be joining us right off the gate. We're going to bring her in right now. And then we're going to be joined by Stephen Menking in the second half of the show. Real quick, we talked about the implantable health devices, and I did some research yesterday on some of the latest documents that they came out with, and what they have at healthit.gov is a health information technology patient engagement handbook where they talk about tracking patient generated health data by interconnecting patients and their records into a digital wearable technology to fill health gaps and ultimately provide clinical decision-making care delivery and health outcomes in real time from a remote location. And they have goals that I'm not going to get into today. We're going to bring Tracy on, but I just said that to say that we are going to be at some point doing a show, John, at least part of a show, to talk about these latest findings, because what they are doing is setting up a network that they are going to hook everybody up to. And when we talk about the B system, this very likely could be what is the inception of it, getting people to agree to be chipped or have a device put in you for patient identification and health information. And that, I use that term from a guidance on an FDA document on what a Class 2 special control device is. It's an RFID chip, implantable radio frequency transponder system for patient identification and health information. But we'll talk about that later. We have
kind of gives you a different definition of hook a brother up.
Yeah, it does. Tracy, it's great to have you back on the Hagmann Daily Show. I know you have a lot going on. You've been doing some great research on a number of subjects, and the more we dig into what's going on in Washington, D.C. and in the political world, the crazier it gets. So we're just going to turn it over to you and let you start where you want.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Hey, Tracy. Thank you so much for jumping in today. How are you, dear?
I'm good. Thanks for having me. Oh my gosh, it's been so busy. It's almost, you can't walk away for 10, 15 minutes without something going on. Like right now, I'm just staring at Twitter and I'm seeing that Avenatti locked out his Twitter account. He made it protected. And he said it's because he's dropping some sensitive information in a couple weeks and he wants to make sure he can somewhat control who sees it.
Wow.
Well, a lot of times, Tracy, Twitter will do that for you, but I'm sure you're aware of that.
Of course, yes. Actually, I'm sensitive now, so that's a nice step up for me. I'm a sensitive tweeter.
Tracy, what's going on? You've been dropping some really, really critical videos the last, about 3 or 4 days, and things have become so confusing. They're so all over the place. You've got the better part of half an hour. We're just going to hand the mic to you. This is almost like your show. So please get us up to speed, girl.
Oh, goodness. Okay. Well, hey, please interject whenever you want. I think we should talk about let's talk about the Senate document dumps that came out last week. the Senate Intelligence Committee released, the testimony of Veselnitskaya and Trump Jr. and Rob Goldstone and a bunch of the other people that had testified in regards to the Trump Tower meeting. But in addition to that, they also had dropped the full dossier on, there's a few redactions in there, but there were more memos in that dossier than BuzzFeed dropped. And one of them was actually written in December of 2016, after the election had already happened. Inside of that same little zip, they dropped transcripts motions from a lawsuit that's going on between some folks that were named in the dossier and Christopher Steele and Orbis. And putting two and two together, looking at the lawsuit transcripts or motions, as well as the dossier and some of the stuff that was said, we come to find out that dossier was provided to Fusion GPS, who was instructed to give it to John McCain through David Kramer. So think about that for a second. Confusing enough. Christopher Steele gets unsolicited intelligence from someone we don't know who. He sends it to Fusion GPS. This is outside of the scope of their contract. Fusion GPS takes possession of it and is instructed to give it to John McCain through David Kramer, who is acting on McCain as McCain's like kind of intermediary. And then Kramer is supposed to give it to McCain, who's then supposed to use it for intelligence. In this dossier memo, it states that the FSB was responsible for Guccifer 2, the hacking, and all that stuff that was going on, how they pinned the hack to Russia. And in the dossier, they based the entire memo, that December memo that was not paid by Fusion GPS, that came unsolicited. They based that entire memo on the fact that Michael Cohen was in Prague meeting with these folks and paying them in cash to kind of skirt the responsibility for it and pay him under the table. Well, we know Michael Cohen was never in Prague. So therefore, everything else in that memo has got to be bunk. And it looks to me like both McCain, someone very high up in British intelligence within the government, as well as CrowdStrike, used that memo to bolster their Russians hacked the DNC and John Podesta's emails claim. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, Tracy, and it's very convoluted and confusing, but this is a grand conspiracy that has been ongoing, involving many layers in many agencies and many types of people, both government and civilian. And this is, you clarified that very well. And it's interesting, you mentioned John McCain's role in this. We saw he was in the news recently talking about how he was on his way out and he's going to die. Also, he released a new book where he took further swipes at President Trump. But it's so interesting. Every time, it seems like his involvement is shown in the news or exposed, he retreats into being the sick old man who's going to die again. It's frustrating to watch that.
Yeah, and the other couple interesting...
Tracy, is he dying or is he going on a book tour?
I don't know. It's a nice cover to have, right? It's a nice cover.
Perfect.
No pun intended.
Yeah, 6 feet of cover. So basically, the other thing that really got me in this was that, we had heard a couple weeks ago, all of a sudden, the Michael Cohen was in Prague, McClatchy came out and reported it, and then every media outlet in the country basically based their report off of that one McClatchy report saying that Michael Cohen lied, he was in Prague. Right. And then Michael Cohen came out again and said, no, this is bull. I was never in Prague, ever. This is a lie. You guys still have it wrong. You still have the wrong Michael Cohen.
Didn't he show his passport?
Yeah. And they're trying to say he snuck through Germany. Yeah. Meanwhile, the timing on when they're saying this happened was in late July, early September of 2016, I believe. And if that was the case, there's no way. I mean, his passport proves he was in California. I mean, he's able to prove it with receipts and all kinds of other stuff. So we know it's bunk. It's bunk. And the fact that John McCain is referenced throughout this whole thing with the original dossier and then with this last memo that was written, and not even a few days after this memo was supposedly sent over and written is when we get CrowdStrike coming out and saying that the FSB was behind all this and their official report about Ukrainians being, the Ukrainian army being infiltrated by this malware. And by the way, it also had a lot to do with the hacking of the DNC and Guccifer 2. It basically blows the entire Russia collusion narrative again out of the water.
Yeah, and that's, they're pretty much, they've abandoned, at least the media, and it looks like the deep state have abandoned this Russian narrative for the most part, aside from a few talking heads who bring it up again. But Tracy, let me ask you what's going on with Michael Cohen. There's reports that his legal partner, flips, and we've seen so many of these stories, Manafort flips, Flynn flips, and what could this lawyer even give him? Is this a non-story? Is there anything to this? Because I have not went through and read about this yet.
Let me start off by saying, and this is just my opinion. This is my opinion. Given the research I've done, I am so torn on Michael Cohen. I don't know if he's a good guy or a bad guy. We know that he was friends with, for a very many years since they were younger, Felix Sater. We know he had a close relationship with him. I actually learned recently that Sater was likely the reason why Cohen even got into the Trump sphere. So it's just weird. There's a lot of weird connections back there. It seems like he's always done the right thing by Trump, but I don't know if he's done the right thing in his personal life. So this guy they flipped, supposedly, or that pled to, tax evasion from it was from the medallions, the taxi medallions in New York. Okay. And we know that Michael Cohen owns 12 taxi medallions in New York City, and this person apparently didn't pay the taxes on the income from those. And I don't know what other kind of shady stuff Cohen's doing. I mean, there is a chance he committed a crime. I'm not sure the real impact of this as of right now. But it's interesting, that's for sure.
Yeah, and
Tracy,
Cohen's been with Trump for a long time. I've watched a documentary about Trump, and he was there at the opening of his first Atlantic City casino, I think back in the early 90s or late 80s. So he's been around President Trump for a long time. But John, go ahead.
Cohen didn't start with the Trumps until 2005.
Oh, okay. Maybe.
And that just segues off to just a really quick throwaway comment from me. Tracy, obviously, with the integrity of your work and our commitment to the same, if some of these roads do somehow, through some serpentine, Byzantine itinerary, work back to President Trump, we're going to be some of the first to say so.
Absolutely. Yeah, and as a matter of fact, that's funny that you say that, because I was really nervous. I was really nervous investigating Eric Schneiderman's and the ties to Cohen and everything. There's a lawsuit that was filed. Back in the day, Trump went after Schneiderman hard because Schneiderman was doing some messed up stuff in terms of his interactions with Trump and Trump University and stuff. And reading through this lawsuit, it started to appear as though Trump was paying off Schneiderman to keep quiet and to not let the case go any further. And I'm like phrasing in my head, I don't have to tell people that this is what it looks like he was doing. But then there are a bunch of exhibits attached at the end that completely disprove that. And I knew it because I will be honest, I know that Trump runs his businesses and does everything by the book. He uses the laws to his advantage, but he never breaks the law. And and being in New York my whole life, knowing some people that worked with him, this is just the way Trump is. So it doesn't surprise me that I was going to be wrong in that assessment.
Yeah. And I don't have a problem with, President Trump has a lifetime of real estate and business dealings that he has engaged in with who knows, what kind of people. We've talked about the organized crime angle. There's all kinds of different stuff out there. But, as far as it relates to his presidency, since he's been elected president, I think the American people could care less if the Mueller and other investigations are going to try to get you with some gotcha stuff from your real estate past, whether it's corruption or not. I really don't think the American people at this point care, or the vast majority of them, not these rabid hyenas we see on the news every night and the people who follow them. But the rest of the people, I don't think really care.
No, I don't think so either. And, to be honest, as a developer and as someone who kind of figured out the licensing model in terms of business for Trump, that's how he makes his money, licensing. It's ingenious. When you're in New York City and you're trying to build a building, especially in the 80s, there was like, the unions were all run by mobsters back then. It's not that Trump was a mobster or worked for mobsters or had relationships with mobsters. It's that the mobsters ran the unions. They just ran them. That's it. It was just the way it was. And they cracked down on that eventually. But it's not that there were deals made with these guys or he was working next to them, or it's just, it's really hard to understand. And I'm not trying to say this to be, you have to be in New York to understand how the business, especially in development and construction, works there. It's a swamp. It's dirty and it's gross.
It's, Tracy, we call it the swamp of a different odor. And just to amplify what you just said, and this is something that listeners really should reflect on and consider. President Trump, as you said, particularly back in the early era of his career, he was throwing up glass and stone, not just in New York City, but in all kinds of shady places, in parts of Florida, in Atlantic City, and around the world, where if the wheels aren't greased, the wheels don't turn. But you can grease the wheels within the parameters of the law. It doesn't have to be a backdoor envelope full of cash. And with all of the effort that Fusion GPS and their ilk put toward finding the dirt on this man, if there was an enormous J. Edgar Hoover file on Donald J. Trump somewhere, at this point, it would have been found. But instead, we've got undercover moles apparently garnering paychecks from the CIA and or the FBI. We've got John Brennan into this thing up to his eyeballs. And we have a man who is president of the United States, love him or hate him, who was a successful real estate magnate for 4+ decades. And the people who have been digging, just like little moles, can't find anything on him. And so what do we get? Just like Joe said a minute ago, we've got Mueller, who's going to get you with the gotcha. And there we are.
Yeah, let's actually, that's a good segue into, you were saying, moles and all that in the campaign. Yes, and I believe there are many more that are being talked about right now. As a matter of fact, it appears that the entire outskirt of his campaign were informants, moles, plants. And I've been saying this for, like almost a year and a half now. I think Michael Caputo came out last night on Cavuto's show. Did you guys catch that interview? Please say yes.
You're going to kill me, Tracy. It's next up on my YouTube playlist. Joe, go ahead.
I did read what was said. I did not see the interview, though.
Okay, we got to talk about this. You guys, it's going to blow your minds. I was crazy. It was nuts. In the interview, he's talking to Cavuto, and he's talking about how he had an intermediary come up to him from when he first started as communications director in the beginning of the campaign in May. He had an intermediary come up to him and say, hey, there's someone from inside the government that wants to provide you with some information on Hillary Clinton. And Caputo says he spent a lot of time out in the hallway having these conversations with this intermediary about the information. And he ultimately decides not to take it. And he's really petrified because he thinks it's her emails. And if he takes it, he could be, in trouble. And he says that he didn't even approach the campaign with it because it was his first week and he didn't want to seem like a kook. And then at the end of July, after he'd already gone from the campaign because of what he pulled with Lewandowski, he says that this person came back again trying to give him information on Hillary Clinton. He says, I thought that this information was actually going to be her deleted emails because it was right around the time that happened. And at the end of the interview, he says, I couldn't believe it in October because I was listening to I was looking into the WikiLeaks emails and I realized that all the information about Iran and paying off Iran and all kinds of stuff was in the WikiLeaks. And this was some of the information that they were trying to give to me in May. So he basically said that they were trying to give him the WikiLeaks emails, not the 30,000 deleted emails, but the stuff that ends up in WikiLeaks, like Podesta stuff. That's what he said in his interview. And I said, hold on a second. Whoa. Stop the boat. So I'm trying to figure out why it is that Caputo would be saying this. Because it's obviously not some informant that comes to him with this information to help Hillary Clinton and try and make collusion with Trump. This information was damning on her. It cost her the election in large part, in my opinion. So why is this person coming to Caputo? Well, today he comes out and says, oh, sorry, guys, big misunderstanding. There was nothing to that. he even, he was asked about this during the testimony he gave to the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence in the Senate. He tells them, he's asked if a Russian tried to give him emails. He says no, and he forgets that this person was a mediator talking to him throughout all this time. Then he says he testifies in front of Mueller, and he tells Mueller, yeah, by the way, the WikiLeaks stuff, I had that in my possession. He says Mueller ignores it completely. Well, there's a problem with that, because a couple weeks ago, Caputo, you were on television saying that Mueller was completely focused on Guccifer 2, WikiLeaks, and the DNC leaks. And you said it in 4 different interviews. So it doesn't make much sense for you to come out now and say that he would have ignored something like that you told him, when that's what you say he's focused on.
Wow. Okay. So and big question here, is Caputo going to walk back the GDU to hell remarks that I believe he made across all 4 of those interviews?
I don't know. I know that I know those interviews were really interesting and very scripted. He was like, I'm so afraid. I'm afraid to talk about any of this because they'll pull me back into the special counsel's office and I'll have to pay another $25,000. Meanwhile, he's squawking like for 20 minutes on CNN. In the same day, he had 2 20-minute segments on CNN, 40 minutes on CNN where he's just blah, 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 blah. And then he has 2 10-minute segments on Fox. It's something stinks to high heaven. Remember who he came in through.
Tracy, you're exactly right. It doesn't make sense. And I don't see, this is what bothers me about some of these people, Giuliani included, these people who make these reckless statements. It seems as though they're either intentionally putting out disinformation or they're trying to hurt the president, or I don't know what's going on with this and why, after someone was in the news talking about how they lost their home and, were victims of this witch hunt, would you make these contradictory and otherwise damaging statements? I don't get it.
If what we learned in November through, I put this in my video, if what we learned in November through Steve Pieczenik is true about the coup, the counter coup, that video he did showing his face for the first time in 25 somewhat years, right? If what we learned in that is true, then it appears as though somebody, a white hat, was trying to give Caputo, of all people, I don't know why, information, or Caputo's out there trying to muddy the waters, like you just said.
Joe, Rudy Giuliani, you want to take this one?
Yeah, well, Tracy, what do you think about Rudy Giuliani and what his role is in this? We've seen him make statements that seemed a little, talking about how Michael Cohen possibly have paid off other women, and really a lot of people didn't think he was helping President Trump. I know he is, his associations with the Southern District Court of New York and the importance of that, but do you think he's helping or hurting?
I don't know, and I hate when I'm gray on something, but I don't know. I mean, it could be he's out there running cover, just like I feel like sometimes Joe DeGeneva does. It's an interesting landscape. It's kind of hard to navigate. I don't know at this point if Giuliani's a hurt or a help, or what his purpose is. He's supposed to be the liaison to Mueller. Well, then do that and then come out on television, say certain things that I just think were a mistake. I mean, I suppose that what he said about Cohen ended up working out in everybody's favor if you look back at it, because it kind of tipped off this whole Avenatti, avalanche and got him in trouble. There was an informant that came out with, there's a justice investigation into this guy who leaked the bank information now. We had Schneiderman step down. So you have to wonder if that was a little tip of the cap to start that whole process.
Yeah, it's such a convoluted situation. I want to ask you about this, Trady. The media's role in what we're seeing with this undercover informant. Many are downplaying it, saying that, well, this is, we were trying to protect President Trump. Then others are saying that, well, this is no big deal. This happens all the time. What do you make of this as far as the level of trouble or what these people who conspired to put this together against President Trump are looking at? Do you think this is something illegal that they did? Obviously, we know that this is a criminal conspiracy based on lies, but what do you think will happen? How will this play out?
I do think it's illegal. I think the media is obviously trying, all of a sudden they're treating this as though this story was always accepted and that they always talked about it. Not that they made it a big conspiracy and that the president and all of us were crazy for 2 years now. So my thought is this, the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence report that came out that said there was no, collusion, said specifically Loretta Lynch, everybody had the opportunity, if they thought that this was a big concern, as big of a concern as they're making it out to be, to brief the president about, or the candidate Trump, about what was happening and tell him, so that he could at least have a better view and have it in his perception. Like, look, they might try to do this. They might try to influence your campaign. They didn't do that. They snuck around behind the scenes trying to infiltrate his campaign to find out information. And now they're trying to make it look like they were trying to protect him, but they never told him anything. Doesn't make sense, doesn't pass the smell test at all. And ultimately, these cases are not tried in the court of public opinion, although they need the public to be enraged about them to be able to go forward with these arrests. They're tried in a court of law, and I think at the end of this, we're going to find a bunch of evidence that what the media is peddling is absolutely not the case, and he was spied on.
Well, all very interesting, Tracy, and a lot to think about, a lot to dissect, so many angles we can continue to research. I want to ask you this. We got about 4 minutes left, 3 minutes left. Anything that we did not talk about that you want to get into today? Anything that we didn't cover, or any points you want to make?
Can you cover anything in 3 minutes? Oh, goodness. I think what we're, it's true. Every story is like 30 minutes long. I think what we're going to start to see is an onslaught of disinformation, spin, and from both sides. There's going to be a lot of BS flung out there to see what sticks and try and taint the public's perception of what's happening. So it's really more important than ever for people to use their discernment, put on their monocles, do some of their own detective work, and find some journalists that you can really actually rely on and trust, that use sourcing to show the information they're presenting, and make sure you do some stuff yourself and put your perspective in there, because each one of us are citizen journalists at this time, and they're having a hard time stopping that onslaught of information from being filtered through and the BS being called out while the good stuff remains. So I think we just need to back each other up and keep working together to get the truth out there.
Tracy Beans, I cannot recommend highly enough that our listeners follow Tracy on Twitter for sure, at Tracy Beans, Beanz. Tracy, where else are you? Obviously, your YouTube channel, Tracy Beans, as well. Anywhere else that you've been dropping content lately?
I'm on BitChute as well at Tracy Beans. I'm on DTube and Steemit. DTube is really still clunky, so I'm not there much. And I'm also on Gab occasionally. I'm really horrible at cross-platforming. It's so hard. So Twitter is really where I spend most of my time, and I've been lucky so far in terms of my account staying up. So thank you, John.
Well, thank you, and please keep doing the hard work. I just want to echo what you said. Everyone, put on your monocle. It is citizen journalist Sherlock Holmes time. Joe?
Yeah. Well, Tracy, again, thank you so much for joining us. And hopefully we can have you back on soon, and we can continue to dissect this biggest political scandal in modern American history, probably in American history altogether. It's just insane, the levels of corruption that we have seen, and we have seen no justice yet, despite the best efforts of some. But will it come, or will this all be swept under the rug by something else? That has yet to be seen. But Tracy, thanks so much for your hard work.
Thanks for having me, guys. Love you guys. I'll talk to you soon.
All right.
We love you too, Tracy.
That was Tracy Beans. We have Stephen Menking coming up next. And that was a great interview, great analysis by Tracy. And, this thing is growing into, there's a story. I guess this sums it up really well from the Daily Caller. New York Times columnist worries Mueller investigation actually helping Trump. New York Times columnist Frank Bruni expressed his alarm on Tuesday that special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation into Russian meddling could actually be helping President Donald Trump. The Mueller investigation, Frank argued, is dominating media coverage to the extent it's crowding out coverage of what Trump and his administration are actually doing. Maybe the just published Politico report of Trump's deliberate, cavalier use of a cell phone that doesn't have strict security safeguards would be getting extra attention, if not for the Mueller investigation. Without Mueller in Russia, Scott Pruitt would be closer to center stage with an even brighter, harsher spotlight on him, the liberal columnists continue. So what they're saying is actually the Mueller investigation is providing cover for Trump's other illegal activities, like using a cell phone that doesn't have strict security safeguards. That's a joke. I mean, based on everything that happened with Hillary Clinton, how can this even be an issue for President Trump? Anyway, I don't know, John. What do you think?
It's a fair question. It almost sounds kind of silly. Joe, so far the takeaway today, in my opinion, from Tracy, like I said a moment ago, it is up to each of us to get our magnifying glass and meerschaum pipe and get to the Sherlock Holmes side of life. And I think what you said at the opening of the show, Mueller's plan, gonna get you with the gotcha. That's what we're seeing. Mueller is looking for anyone to misstep, and then he's going to barrage them with affidavits and indictments.
Yeah. And it is, unfortunate that we see people like James Comey still won't go away. James Comey warns attacks, lies about FBI will do lasting damage to the country. Nothing about the lasting damage done by a political witch hunt for the purposes of trying to steal what's left of America and sell it to communism. That's not the disgrace. The disgrace is the president actually winning the election and exposing the corruption for what it is. That's exactly what James Comey is saying. We have with us our guest for the second half of the show, Stephen Menking. Stephen, it's great to have you back on. We have oil prices and gas prices rising pretty high. I want to get your thoughts on where we'll see those end up. I know in New York City, headline said yesterday they're already at $5 a gallon. We're up to about $3.15 here, where 2 weeks ago we were at $2.99, $3. How high are we going to see gas prices go this summer, Stephen?
Well, if I knew, fellas, I would be making bets in the commodities markets. But what I certainly can say is that the upward trajectory in those prices is definitely back, and it looks to be slightly unpegged from just the standard movement of the dollar relative. First, a quick sound check. I'm using a temporary microphone here while my Darth Vader headset gets fixed. So, is it coming through okay?
You sound great, Stephen.
Thanks, Joe. I really appreciate that. So
I'm going to mute out so I can melt down.
No, it's all good. A little bit of light humor in the midst of what is otherwise an extraordinarily tumultuous time that we're living through. So if I'm looking at the oil contracts ever since they sort of bottomed out for the year in the winter, it's been on a steady increase, and you can even see this going back to the bottom of the Brent contract under $50, dating back to last summer. So when we're looking at this dynamic, we have to consider that oil is not just determined by supply and demand. It's also determined by geopolitical events, and even more relevantly, the paper contracts that get traded. So if people want to push oil in one direction or another, we'll note that back in the 2014-2015 timeframe, part of the approach to counter the Russian ascendancy in that regard was to push the oil price down below their sustainable levels, and that of course harmed Saudi Arabia in the process. But the brief primer is just looking from a technical analysis perspective. If oil wants to continue its trajectory along the current lines, wouldn't surprise me to see a pullback. But if it gets really strong and we start to see it back above 100 again, then the impact on gas prices is going to be substantial, in part because in the intervening period between the last time we saw gas prices up this high, sort of in 2008, and then between 2011 and 2014, we saw different dynamics in terms of the dollar as a currency, as well as the amount of taxes that get imposed. And so typically the cycle will take place where when the gas prices go down, that's when politicians have a bit more leeway to impose an extra tax on gas that it's easier for people to absorb. And so that we see, despite oil only being at $80 a barrel, comparable prices to when it was when oil was 110, 120 back several years ago. So how high is it going to get? I don't know, but do your best to manage that appropriately. The problem that people are dealing with now is that it's just an extra ding to the pocketbook at a time when people are still heavily in debt, and every sort of differential meaningfully on a day in or week in, week out basis that can affect their spending and savings plans from a paycheck perspective. But depending on how things go in terms of foreign policy, whether we're talking about the Middle East and Iran, as well as what's going on in China, all of these things sort of come together in oil, and it's a very challenging market to really get a handle on. But the upward trajectory is here. Doesn't mean we couldn't see a pullback of 10 to 20%. Probably a modest move down is overdue. But because these markets are paperized to a certain extent and not necessarily based on fundamentals, something that we understand quite well, then we could see whatever price action the people with the largest pockets want to determine.
Stephen, that was excellent analysis, and I've got to do a mea culpa to our entire listening audience. If you heard a lilt in Stephen Minking's voice, and God bless him, he's trying to give us a good, concrete answer to a particular problem that affects all of our pocketbooks, and I have been messing with him via IM on Skype. I sent an emoji, and I didn't know they do this, but it's more like a GIF. So it's this big happy face that's guffawing with rain falling out of both of his eyes, and so Stephen, you held that together very nicely. But back to being serious, Stephen, I read an interesting article this morning, switching gears a little bit, but about the outward migration out of the state of Illinois. And unbeknownst to me, the land of Lincoln has an outpouring of middle-class Americans that is almost commensurate to what we're seeing out of the state of California. So we're really seeing people vote with their feet vis-a-vis their dollars, again, out of California and Illinois as well. When we look at the domestic economy as a whole, what is your take on this massive movement of Americans around the country at this time?
Well, the bifurcation that we're seeing, John, is not just in politics and worldview and spirituality. It's also in economic considerations. And so the states are supposed to be laboratories where different policies can be implemented and achieve different results. And of course, there are different background considerations like natural resource endowment, demographics of the population, et cetera. But what we're seeing now is the gap between liberal economic policies and conservative economic policies, if that's even an appropriate label. It's more like statist and in terms of large taxes, large federal government influence, all of the rest of it, versus light touch, more freedom oriented policies. I mean, if you're paying, we're talking 6, 8, 10% state tax and elevated property taxes on top of that, and there's more transportability in jobs, more jobs are technology based and can be done from a distance, then why wouldn't you consider relocating to a state that doesn't have any income tax, like Florida or some other options where it's at least lower? What the key dynamic to point out here is that this is an ongoing cycle that, without a dramatic change in policy, a different vision about how to approach governance, the old solutions that were never solutions in the first place are simply just not going to work anymore. So what happens is, if there are additional taxes imposed, then the people with capital who are most impacted by those taxes are going to seek options to alleviate that, whether we're talking about regulatory structures or hiring lawyers and accountants to set things up, or, to keep it a little bit more simple, just leaving the state altogether to relocate to a more tax-friendly jurisdiction. The same thing is happening in my home state of Connecticut, where the hedge fund industry and the financial services area in high net worth districts outside of New York, because of the additional taxes, those people were relocating to other places, and that's caused some significant stress on the pocketbooks in Hartford, in the state capital. And so what happens is, you see these higher levels of taxes in order to support different programs. We won't get into whether or not the programs themselves are a good idea, but the point is they need money and they're justified by raising taxes, and that's done in typically a haphazard manner without much thought for what the long-range impact is going to be, because you just say, oh, okay, if we bump taxes up by this much and assume that everything stays the same, then we'll get this much extra revenue to cover things, and if we don't, well, we'll just borrow it or we'll go to the federal government. But it's sort of like an internal Ponzi scheme in that you're not considering the reaction to the action. And that's the simplified kind of policy analysis that is taught in schools and skates for conventional wisdom these days in terms of the state houses. And so when the people who pay the largest burden of the taxes, whether you say that that's fair or not, this is just a standard course of action, a statement of fact. This is what in economics we call a positive claim rather than a normative claim. Positive claims deal with what is, and normative claims deal with what should be. It is positively true in that economic sense that when you increase tax burdens on people who are then incentivized to go elsewhere, then they do go elsewhere. And when they do that, you no longer get any tax revenue from them as a state. And so what happens is you lose your source of tax revenue. So your budget deficits get worse and your financial situation gets worse. And the typical response to this is, oh, okay, I guess we're in a little bit of a deeper hole. So we either have to borrow money, or absent that, well, we got to raise taxes again. And so we end up in this vicious cycle where we've seen property taxes in blue states go through the roof. And in some red states, they're saying, let's incentivize people to come in. And this is a different model, the Keynesian model on one hand versus the more supply side model on the other. And there's back and forth about which works. But like you said, John, people are voting with their feet out of places like California and Illinois and Connecticut and into places like Texas and Florida and Arizona. And that's not, of course, part of this could be attributable to just simple demographic change and people moving around. But there's also this trend to consider and this obvious policy logic that lies behind it.
Very well said, Stephen. We broke down a lot of subjects today with Tracy Beans before you came on. I want to get your opinion on this as we got about 17 minutes left. What we have seen with the President Trump administration and the talk of a FBI informant working inside the campaign. Do you see that the American public is, in their sentiment in general, cares about this? Do you think this is something that is criminal and should be investigated? We should see, another special counsel, or we should see some kind of hardcore investigation of the FBI. Do you think any of that's going to happen? I mean, each day that goes by, more and more information comes out about this criminal conspiracy that was set up against the president, and it seems like each day that more comes out, less is done about it.
Well, we do see this dynamic going from President Trump tweeting something out and being called a crazy lunatic conspiracy theorist, and let's invoke the 25th Amendment and everything else like that right away, to, hey, maybe there's some validity to this. There's some evidence to support it, maybe, but it's speculative. It's coming from odd sources. And then, the New York Times and the Washington Post wrote about it. So it turns out that was true. But there's an explanation that fits another narrative that goes beyond the pale in terms of the circumlocutions and the logic that's necessary to get people on board. But when will we approach that breaking moment? Gentlemen, I'd like to posit a hypothesis here that what we've been seeing, particularly over the course of the last several months, but realistically going back, let's say, almost a year even, is the gradual moving of the Overton window, but in the direction of people becoming more and more accustomed to identifying the institutions that were responsible for upholding justice and protecting the Constitution as corrupt. I mean, if you look at opinion and general word association for people relative to the FBI and the DOJ and the rest of it, these should be the institutions that have pristine reputations. But what we're seeing is a gradual shifting in perception where it's now easier for people to accept a line of reasoning that includes the corruption. And there's also a connected linguistic association to the deep state, quote unquote, as being part of this corruption. So I think that the pump has been being primed here for quite some time for hopefully the revelations that will come up in the first phase of the OIG report. And one thing that's interesting is that there are always attempts to explain things after the fact. And I don't know, Joe, whether we'll ever hit this like definitive moment of clarity where we'll say, okay, there was before this time and people were asleep and didn't demand anything. Generally speaking, there are always people who are awake and doing research and sounding the alarm as loudly as possible, including your team and everyone else. And then after that, it's, oh, well, everybody's on board and we gotta restore justice and righteousness. I'm not sure that we'll see that flashpoint moment. We may only understand it retroactively, and that it may refer to this entire time and this sequence of events. So I will wait. I've always been waiting to see what the OIG report would do, and we supposedly have the draft version circulating, which means that at least this first phase of the Clinton email investigation is imminent. And obviously, we know some certain things out there in the public information that are not friendly for people like Peter Strzok and James Comey and the rest of this gang of hooligans. But ultimately, where is all of this headed? I think timing plays a big part in it. But over the course of the past 3 months, the claims that would have been easily or just trivially dismissed as it's conspiracy, how dare these attacks continue, are then one by one over the course of time I'm not even going to say proven right, but then forced to be admitted to by these legacy media sources. And the first clue that I got for that was when Time magazine, of all places, published a couple articles, I believe either in late April or early this month in May, that seemed to admit to some of these things. And I thought, oh, okay, well, now the cover your rear end from a credibility standpoint needs to begin. And as you'll notice, the explanations that are being concocted in order to deal with these things become increasingly bizarre. And there still will be people who buy it because they're basing everything on the worldview that Trump is evil and that the ends justify the means. And so whatever was necessary to remove him would be valid or legitimate. Never mind legal. That's not the right standard. Or moral. That's also not the standard. It's about power dynamics for these people. And so there's a tweet from Scott Adams that I found amusing earlier this morning. He says, 4 things to understand about Spygate. Number 1, there was no spy in the Trump campaign. Number 2, the spying that did not happen was totally justified. Number 3, it would be bad for national security to identify the spy who doesn't exist. Number 4, his name is Stefan. So, we're in this twilight zone of ex post facto explanations, and all of these different things seem to be coming to a head. We're getting this narrative change, this Overton window shifting incrementally, but the incremental shifts seem to be happening quicker and quicker. And I think we're racing to the point of official documentation release. And it's worth noting, gentlemen, that when I think about the release of the initial 50-pager OIG report talking about McCabe and his leaks, that was an extraordinarily thorough and investigative report, a statement of fact. There were certainly reactions to it, like, oh, you shouldn't do this, or anything else of that nature. You can't fire him. Oh, it's obstruction of justice. The same old claims that we always get. But there was never a dispute, really, about what actually happened. There was never an attempt to impugn the credibility of that OIG report, because I believe it was a thorough and a truthful investigation. There was no way to counter that. So you have to play a slightly different game. But with the media ratings that we're seeing, and with the different message control, and with the shifts that are going on, we may be close to that fulcrum point. I don't know, and I know that it's been a long time coming, particularly for those of us who pay very close attention to this and who have public source documentation and evidence that crimes have been committed. It's like, well, where is this stuff already? And my view is that we're going to have to utilize the government release of documents, particularly these OIG reports, which will hopefully come out in stages prior to the midterms, in order to unify and communicate about a specific kind of a platform of action, and to mobilize widespread calls for specific acts of justice in the restoration of the rule of law. Because if that doesn't happen, then it just feels like we're going to be in this swampland marsh mess for the rest of our lives, gentlemen, and that's not where I want to spend it.
One of the things that I see so troubling about this is that there is no leadership. There is no bulldog at the spear of this, taking the lead and saying, all right, this is what's going to happen. You know, these people need to be investigated. These people need to be fired. This is how this is. There's no willingness, it seems, to prosecute the guilty parties in this. And that is really troublesome to me. I don't know where you want to go from here, Stephen, but it's just, we've seen this drag on for so long, and the media and the Hollywood and political industries are all on the anti-American side. And we see it day after day, and we see no action. The only thing we see is more information of how much more corrupt and expansive the attempted conspiracy against President Trump was.
Right, and so we have to imagine that as much as we see, it was even more vast than that, because from a tip of the iceberg perspective, it's reasonable to conclude that we don't have the full perspective and all of the information and all of the documentation. And so, you know, there's plenty even now to begin those sorts of proceedings, and it's the hypothesis of many researchers, and I would incline myself to erring on this side of things, that there actually are things going on behind the scenes, and that's based on inferential conclusions. I obviously don't have any hard witness. I'm not like in a grand jury that's been impaneled or anything, so I can't speak with authority on it. But the pattern does make sense to me, and so we will have to see. And at a certain point after the OIG report, if there aren't these kind of things going on, then there does need to be a more unified and a coordinated call that just goes beyond people tweeting hashtag, lock them up or stuff like that. There has to be something that is more properly organized into a movement, rather than the sort of decentralized separate voices all like screaming out in the darkness and then getting bopped down by the social media companies. But I think a good place to go here is to Proverbs, because we certainly all need some wisdom from the Lord and the discernment of the Holy Spirit at this time. And let's go to Proverbs 17. I'm going to read a few of these verses out of the New King James Version, and then comment a little bit at the end. And I'd be curious as to your perspective here. I thought that these verses were particularly topical. So starting in verse 4, we'll read verse 4 and 5. An evildoer gives heed to false lips. A liar listens eagerly to a spiteful tongue. He who mocks the poor reproaches his maker. He who is glad at calamity will not go unpunished. I think I'll skip over the commentary on this specifically. It, to a large extent, speaks for itself, but we'll go through a couple more of these, and then we'll sort of bounce it around. Want your guys' thoughts on it. Verse 10, rebuke is more effective for a wise man than 100 blows on a fool. Verse 15, he who justifies the wicked and he who condemns the just, both of them alike are an abomination to the Lord. And then verses 27 and 28, he who has knowledge spares his words, and a man of understanding is of a calm spirit. Even a fool is counted wise when he holds his peace. When he shuts his lips, he is considered perceptive. So, on many of these things, gentlemen, I have to hold my peace, and I have to try to maintain a calm spirit, and that's only through the peace that passes understanding. I did do a quick Twitter thread on that the other day. You can find us at On The Objective on Twitter, and give it a try to follow. See if you unfollow automatically. But that's neither here nor there at the moment. But we do have to be sober-minded, of a calm spirit, willing to sit and listen and to hold our peace. But that time is not permanent. We don't always have to hold our peace. In fact, in certain situations, such as this one, we are obligated to speak out. But when we do so, we have to do so in an appropriate manner. Because, like we read in verse 5, he who is glad at calamity will not go unpunished. Let us not forget that this is a situation, as much as it riles us up, even in terms of righteous anger, this is a mournful situation. What has happened to us? What has happened to our country, where now people are even saying, well, what's the big deal? What is the big deal? Well, it's only all of the core fundamental values of morality that this country was built upon, the real bastion of freedom that's been stolen from us and corrupted. Everything is at stake here, and I think that because of the barrage of all of this information, nothing about the next levels of corruption that will soon to be unveiled, if probability is any guide, none of those will necessarily be quite as shocking either. Nonetheless, what we have to do, we have to avoid giving heed to false lips, and we can't listen eagerly to these spiteful tongues that are raised up. It's one thing for me to note who is making noise and who is staying silent, because the people making noise, I mean, I honestly don't know what they're doing. They're liars, and why should anyone listen to them apart from if they already agree with the ideology to parrot that same point? But these people are proven liars, but it seems like until there is, Joe, to your point, the kind of criminal prosecution and something definitive on that end, until we see that, then there's still going to be a large group of people, or bots, like it's hard to tell based on Twitter mentions and comments, who view these people as credible and even as role models. Imagine that. Imagine it. But that is America.
Stephen, you just made a point that I want to amplify, and I'll give it to Joe to take us out this afternoon. And by the way, thank you for your time. ontheobjective.org, that's where you want to go to connect with Stephen Minking. Stephen, when the whistleblowing and the reportage on the enormous, multifaceted corruption in Washington, D.C., and in New York City and in Hollywood, when it becomes ambient noise because it's essentially information overload, then it becomes almost worthless because it is such a massive tidal wave of information trying to permeate an already saturated marketplace where people basically cannot absorb anymore. And that's just an excellent point that you made. Lastly, please give us the book, chapter, verse on the Proverbs that you read.
Once again, that was Proverbs 17, and the specific verses were 4, 5, 10, 15, 27, and 28. Of course, all of Proverbs and all of Proverbs 17 is useful for instruction and for improving in wisdom. As I was reading through, those are just the verses that jumped out to me as what we need to hear, in particular in this moment where it's difficult to know which end is up. But we need to represent God, and something that I've mentioned before, but that Pastor Carter Conlon at Times Square Church often mentions, that we will be the only Bibles that many people ever read. And that's a fair enough statement, if and only if, because people don't really read anymore, and audiobook is too long and the words are a little bit weird and it's unfamiliar and people haven't grown up with it. But at any rate, the point that I'm trying to make here, gentlemen, is that our conduct has to be unimpeachable. Our conduct has to be thoroughgoing, informed, and measured, and sober, and appropriate, because we are going through a period where character is incredibly important, and character can only come from a change of mind, a change of heart that's inspired and directed by God. And so faith is what matters most in this kind of environment, because if we lean on our own understanding, we're going to be misled. But if we rely on the discernment of the Holy Spirit and stay close to God in these times, then he will show us a way through. He will guide our feet. He will use our lives to impact others. But like I said, gentlemen, amidst the anger and the vitriol and the fiery social media posts that you see everywhere on all sides, remember that there are people who are lost, and that this is a mournful time. How did we get here? It's a time of godly sorrow. What did we do personally to enable this, and how can we make it right? We have to start by pressing into God.
Very well said, Stephen, and that will do it for us today. We are out of time. Don't forget our sponsor, simplycleanfoods.net, promo code simplyclean. We will be back tonight on the Hagmann Report, and then tomorrow here at 2 o'clock. Have a great day, everyone.
The Hagmann Daily Show is brought to you by the Hagmann Report. Tune in to the Hagmann Report weekdays, 7 to 10 p.m. Eastern Time. For more information, go to HagmannReport.com. That's HagmannReport.com.